Hello, my name is Troy Provenzano, and my topic was on irrigation in antiquity. So as you all probably know, irrigation was one of the most important aspects to society, and it basically molded society in the way it is. For example, the picture on the left shows the Nile River and the Nile Delta flowing into the Mediterranean. This river was essential for irrigation, and that's why one of the most famous ancient civilizations sprouted right here. The other river valley civilization that really affected Western civilization today was Mesopotamia, which also was between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. So, to go over an outline of what I'm going to discuss in this video. First, as I mentioned a second ago, I'm going to be discussing irrigation in the river valley civilizations, specifically Egypt and Mesopotamia, because yes, there were other river valley civilizations, but these two were the most important in basically guiding Western civilization to where it is now. Then I'm going to discuss hydraulic technologies, talk about those kind of technologies before we jump into aqueducts. And before we talk about Roman aqueducts, I'm just going to give you an overview of aqueducts from other civilizations like Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and Greece. And then we're going to focus on Roman aqueducts for a little bit. Then I'm going to reroute my direction to the east. And we're going to talk about China and India. While most of the stuff in China and India did basically follow the same way Egypt and Mesopotamia did, I'm not going to be discussing that. I'm going to be mainly discussing the differences and how their systems of irrigation differed from the ones we mainly know. And then I'm going to talk about irrigation during the Islamic Golden Age, so years later, and talk about the advances they had during that time. And then I'm going to have my sources. So, let's get started. So, irrigation in the river valley civilizations. So, obviously, before the invention and implementation of aqueducts, as I previously said, rivers heavily affected the location and reach of civilizations. All the civilizations that we know of, the main ones at least, sprouted on the coast of rivers. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Nile River in Egypt and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. These rivers were essential for everyday life, whether it be transportation, commerce, access to fresh water for drinking, and mainly irrigation. So they could grow their food and have no worries about finding good soil and just worrying about getting water. So, while both Egypt and Mesopotamia originally just used the flood of the rivers to irrigate their fields, they implemented canals and dikes and actual systems to simplify the process so they didn't have to wait for rivers to flood. And because if you know, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers had very inconsistent flood cycles. Egypt had a very consistent one, but the Mesopotamians were basically kind of at the will of the rivers. So if the rivers decided to flood at the wrong time, your food could be, the crops could be destroyed. And it actually kind of reflects the Mesopotamians' kind of cynical view on the world. So let's jump into Mesopotamia. So obviously, again, the cities in Mesopotamia were built along the branches of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. One exception, of course, was this ancient city of Ur, which was originally built on marshland. And when they built the city, the marshes were drained with ditches, which ended up being the precursor to the irrigation canals. So, it's kind of ironic to know that the Fertile Crescent on its own was pretty infertile by default. And the fact that we have Sumerian writings that mention the massive surplus of bumper crops seems to prove that the system of irrigation was not just important, but essential to even society forming in the Fertile Crescent. So this kind of indirectly proves that irrigation was of major importance to Mesopotamia. However, it's not all indirect evidence. Archaeologists have discovered sickles and hoes dating back to 4000 BCE and tablets recording grain tallied from 3500 BCE. So we know irrigation was a major part of their society. All right, now we're on to Egypt. So obviously there were mentions of canals in Egypt in writings from the Old Kingdom. But during the Middle Kingdom, major irrigation projects were underway, so it became much more prevalent in their writing. In one example that we know of, the pharaoh Amenemhet III, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, enlarged both Lake Moeris in the Fayum, as denoted by the red arrow on the map, and also added a dike between the canal connecting the Fayum and the Lake Moeris to the Nile. Now, obviously the lake was, a natural forming thing, but expanding it created a much larger area of irrigation. So it would irrigate the Fayum, which is an elevated area with a lot of grass and greenery, so they could add more irrigation in that area, also noted by the red arrow with the words El Fayum. But also, the dike between the Nile and the lake, this provided irrigation water to the Nile Delta during the seasons when the Nile River was very dry. So this is one of the major irrigation projects. And by the New Kingdom of Egypt, the irrigation system was highly organized and developed, and it even granted the creation of a new government title, the Chief of Irrigation. So it was very important to the Egyptians. So let's move on to hydraulic technologies. So both Egypt and Mesopotamia used a device called a shaduf, or shaduf, which is a simple crane-like system to lower and raise a bucket into a canal to collect water. So if you look at the picture on the left, that is what a shaduf looked like. A worker would lower a bucket connected to a rope into the water, and the weight at the other end of the pole, as you can see on the left, would allow him to easily lift the bucket back up. And then he would dump the bucket into the two transporting containers he brought with him, and then he would bring it to the fields where they could use it to irrigate the fields. Eventually, this was replaced by what's called a noria, which is a water wheel that was turned by a worker, which would bring water up at a much faster speed than the shaduf would. And again, later it was replaced with the Archimedes screw, which we are all probably familiar with, which allowed one person to lift large quantities of water with almost minimal effort. And while these technologies were important, it still required workers to collect the water and walk it to where they needed to bring it, or use cattle, which just made this whole perfectly optimized system kind of obsolete when they had to transport it slowly. So that was when they implemented aqueducts. So on the right here is an image from an aqueduct in India called the Hampi Aqueduct. And as you can see, the fact that there is one in India shows that aqueducts were all over the world, which makes it pretty impossible to pinpoint the origin of aqueducts, since the Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Greeks, Indians, and Romans all implemented them. However, the earliest aqueduct that we know of was built in 691 BCE by the Assyrians in Mesopotamia, and it was about 55 kilometers in length, so not super short for the time. And while the Romans built their aqueducts hundreds of years later, they had a massive system that stretched all across the empire. So it pretty much completely overtook all the other aqueduct systems by the sheer size of it. So let's talk about the aqueducts in ancient Rome. So while the Greeks and Egyptians preferred short but steep aqueducts to transport water quickly within their limited city-states or cities in Egypt, with the Romans, they preferred to use long aqueducts with a small gradual slope so they could travel much farther. But the thing is, with these small gradual slopes with the Roman aqueducts, it would take water a long time for it to travel from one location to the next. So the Romans implemented, I guess, different chambers within the aqueducts to basically temporarily increase the velocity of the water so it would not take too long. They implemented things called drop shafts, step cascades, and chutes with a steeper slope at regular intervals, which would just boost the water. So on the right, you have an example of a drop shaft, or a diagram of a drop shaft. So the water would travel through the upper canal, or upper aqueduct, and it would fall down into this like kind of reservoir type thing, and it would push water forward down the rest of the aqueduct at a much faster speed. So it acted almost like a booster in Mario Kart, and you drive over it and the water just got a big boost and shot forward, and then it would go down for a bit and eventually reach another one of these systems. So again, I apologize for the the pixels on the screen, but here are two more examples of things they use to increase the velocity. So on the left, you have what's called a steep, smooth chute, which it's pretty simple, honestly. It's just a slightly steeper chute in the aqueduct that would just temporarily increase the velocity and cause it to boost down a bit until it reached the next one. And on the right, a step channel, which the water would like cascade over each step, like a waterfall, and that would again just increase the velocity. And here is a picture of the aqueduct at the Pont de Gard River, the aqueduct of Pont de Gard at the Gard River in France. So these aqueducts were all over the extent of the Roman Empire. And looking at it, it just really goes to show the engineering masterfulness of the ancient Romans. Because this thing is thousands of years old and is still standing to this day, which is very impressive. So now we're going to shift our focus away from the west and kind of go towards the east. So I'm not really going to talk about like all the aqueduct systems and like canal systems in the east because they were very similar to that in the west, but I'm going to talk about some interesting differentiations between the east and the west in their systems of irrigation. So first we're going to talk about China and the Dujong irrigation system. So this was one of the biggest irrigation systems or any projects of all time, especially of the time, because I feel like now there'd be more important systems, bigger projects because of the technology we have. But in ancient times, this was the biggest irrigation project. So coming from the north, or the top of the picture, the Dujong River was split into the inner river and outer river. So the outer river is the river traveling to the left corner of the picture, and the inner river is traveling to the right. And these two rivers were again split off into 6 canals. So the inner river, as you can see, is split off into those 4 canals on the bottom right. The one on the right looks like one, but if you can tell, it splits off into 2 there. And the outer river would split off into 2 more down the river, so it's not in this picture, unfortunately. And those canals, those 6 canals, had up to 500 irrigation ditches in total, splitting off from them, controlled by a gate for each. So there was no need for lifting water and transporting it. It was just a almost self-sustaining system. And it was perfect because the river flowed at a very slight slope. So the water wouldn't move too fast and destroy the crops, and it wouldn't move too slow so the crops would dry up. It was self-sustaining. And each one of those ditches was controlled by a gate, so if one got too much water, you could lower the gate. If it got not enough, you could lift it. And what's very interesting about this system of irrigation is that it is still in operation to this day. And because of technology, it went from irrigating about 200,000 hectares of land in Antiquity to now irrigating about 600,000 hectares. Again, with expansions and modern day technology, which would improve it drastically. But this is one of the irrigation systems that is still active to this day. And now we're going to move on to India. So the systems in India were very similar to those in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, in the way that they had dams, canals, reservoirs, aqueducts. They also had large water tanks and wells to irrigate, which Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece did have them, but they were not implemented that much. However, this system of irrigation was heavily controlled by the state and monetized for their supply of water for irrigation. So, depending on the method of irrigation, so based on whether you were as you can see, there were 3 distinct rates for lands irrigated by the state. So state irrigated, they would help irrigate the lands. And there was a uniform rate for land irrigated by the canals, wells, and water tanks. So it was very government focused, which I find very interesting, that they had a very strict hierarchy of irrigation. Now we're going to talk about the last thing we're talking about. That was weird. The last thing we're going to talk about is irrigation during the Islamic Golden Age. So early in the Islamic Empire, this is the 8th century, by the way. So we're far past Antiquity. We're more into the Middle Ages, I guess. So early in the Islamic Empire, there was a massive agricultural revolution in which the Arabs diffused 17 crops. Basically, diffused means they took crops from other areas and brought them to the Islamic Empire and basically climatized them and figured out how to properly grow these new crops that they couldn't normally grow in those areas. And I'm going to read the 17 crops they diffused in the Islamic Empire. So of the 17, it was rice, sorghum, hard wheat, sugarcane, cotton, watermelon, eggplant, spinach, artichoke, colocasia, sour oranges, lemons, limes, bananas, plantains, mangoes, and coconut palms. And again, another one of the things they did, the Arabs also made summer, which was usually a dry season, not great for planting crops, an active agricultural season, since they brought crops from tropical India, which required a lot of heat. So during the summers, they would grow the plants that required a lot of heat, and during the winter months, they would plant crops that didn't require a lot of heat. So it was very, very organized and consistent system. However, this new agricultural system required much more water than was previously necessary. So by the 8th century, the Arabs had expanded most of the irrigation systems of antiquity that basically went into disrepair, and also added their own systems. And one of the things they used was called a qanat, which would tap groundwater, and they used systems of water wheels and animals to transport the water from those taps to irrigation. So that gave them the extra boost of water that they needed to irrigate their fields. Here are my sources. Thank you for listening. Hope you have a good day.